702.
The best of the Money Show from this week.
Welcome to the best bits of The Money Show, a digest of some of the most important insights, comments, interviews, and thoughts from the show this week. It's probably a good idea. It is available, of course, as a podcast, to send a podcast to someone who you think needs to hear it. Maybe if it's someone about to buy a house, they need to hear from Warren Ingram this week. Maybe if they're sort of thinking about BE, they need to hear from Saki Macozoma this week. So just forward that on to whoever you think needs to hear it. To start, some of the news stories that we thought were important from this week. The South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, reporting its latest business confidence index, had, as they put it, lost some momentum. The index going down by 8.6 points in April, but then regained a few points in May. Just does show you that still business confidence is very, very fragile in South Africa. The big story internationally, of course, is what's been happening in Los Angeles. Protests against immigration and customs enforcement raids. They began at the beginning of the month. They've spread beyond California, in some cases, to many other states in the U.S. There's a big military parade scheduled in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, and that might well spark a few more protests as well. And here, the Mineral Resources and Petroleum Minister Gwede Mantashe appearing to backtrack on empowerment requirements on prospecting rights. There was big pushback from the industry. Experts had warned it would hurt investment.
702.
You're listening to the best of The Money Show.
The Money Show.
Tonight, we bring you a mixture of stories from the world of money from the week that has been. It was a really interesting conversation. Your shapeshifter this week was Saki Macozoma, the chair of Vodacom and Safika Holdings, opening up about his journey through Robben Island, from the Eastern Cape to Parliament, Transnet, and eventually Vodacom and Safika, talking about some of the big issues facing us as a nation at the moment.
Well, I grew up in two places. I was born in Port Elizabeth in KwaZulu. So that was my primary family. I was sent to the Transkei to a place called All Saints Mission, Anglican Mission, in Engcobo district, to stay with my parents. One of the reasons, my grandparents, one of the reasons my parents gave for sending me there was with the introduction of Xhosa as a medium of instruction in the school. They said, you better go back to the mission and go and learn proper English.
Sure. How do you feel about that now? Because, I mean, the way we view language has changed completely.
I think it was good for me in the sense that I have the foundation, and I think the best foundation in education that I could get from All Saints. I am also an urban person in the sense that I did all my high school in Port Elizabeth. So for me, where I was really conscious was in Port Elizabeth when I was at high school. And that community was about a number of things, but one of the most prominent things was sport. And sport was rugby and cricket, and other kind of indoor sports, and boxing as well. And therefore sport was very, very important in our upbringing. And when we read the newspaper, you started from the back page, from the sport page, and then went the opposite direction.
Do you play all three of those sports?
I used to play rugby, and I played more soccer than any of those, but I follow all of them.
You were in the Eastern Cape in the Transkei. I mean, the sort of hotbed of the ANC. I mean, that's where the ANC comes from in many ways. Sort of, that area. How did you end up in politics? I mean, where did it come from? Was there a family link? Did something happen along the way?
No, it came when I was a child. All Saints Mission was a place where there were Anglican nuns from Europe, as well as the priest in charge was always an English-speaking person. And because there's a hospital there, I became conscious very early of disparities. I became conscious of diseases such as kwashiorkor because I had aunts who were working at the hospital. And that image stayed with me for a very long time. But I'm talking about the early 60s then, and the so-called silent 60s. So there wasn't much political activity in that area at that time. We had a priest, Father Granga, who got arrested from time to time. We didn't quite know, what was going on. The political consciousness came about later when I was in PE mostly, And it came through sport. When SACOS came about with a slogan that you can play in normal sport in an abnormal society. And so all of a sudden, whilst we were following sports, there was politics there. And there was resistance built into sport. For instance, in rugby, we broke away to what was called the KwaZulu Rugby Union, or Kwaru, which was one of the prominent black rugby playing teams in the country. And the same thing in soccer with people like Aaron Rensbeck. We broke away and created a non-racial soccer board. And so the correlation between sport and political consciousness was very strong.
Cheeky Watson was doing the same. Wasn't he involved in some of that?
Yes, he was. The Watson brothers were doing that. And in fact, they broke away from the Eastern Province to go and play rugby in the townships. And that was pretty something in those days.
So you ended up in politics. You ended up being arrested. You did end up on Robben Island. And all of that must have been very, very difficult times for you and for your family. And you came back to South Africa. I'm trying to remember the date in which you were released. It was before 94, was it not?
Yes. I was arrested in 1976 and sentenced in 1977. And I spent those years on Robben Island. So I was released in 1981. And yes, it was a very difficult time, but, one took a view. There were two other options things that could have happened to me. One was I would have left the country anyway and gone into exile. The other one would have been I could have died in the 76 uprising, as many people did. And in a sense, there was a relief that when you're in jail, you're in jail. They can't jail you twice. But to arrive there as a high school student at the age of 18, 19, it's not easy. Jail is not easy for anybody. But I think the spirit that we found and created for ourselves was very sustaining. One of the things I did when I got to Robben Island was actually that very year that I arrived to write my matric and pass it. And so there was always also a purpose of advancement. And I always tell people that when I got to Robben Island, I remembered what my grandmother used to say: they should never take away what they brought that you have in. And so my resolve to myself was, whatever happens here, what I came in with should be better than what and they won't take away what I brought here.
It's quite a story in a way, and I'm sure it was tougher than you explain it.
Oh yeah, of course there are moments. There are moments. There's never enough food. When we arrived, we slept on sisal mats. But we fought. Yeah. And in the end, in that kind of prison, you have an equilibrium for 2 years or a year or something like that. A new warder comes, or head of the prison comes and changes things, and you go back into fighting mode. But what I do remember are the hunger strikes. Yeah. As well. And I remember when we were doing a hunger strike, we used to call it Bobby Sands, because there was one in Ireland where Bobby Sands died as a result of a hunger strike. And fighting over those kinds of methods and moderating people, I think taught me how to negotiate, how to get along with other people, and how not to judge too harshly.
I'm going to fast forward a little bit, if you don't mind, and you come out of prison. Eventually we have elections. Nelson Mandela becomes the president. You become a member of parliament for the ANC. And then a couple of years after that, you become the CEO, you become the managing director, I think it was called then, of Transnet. What informed that decision? Why did you decide to go in that direction from being an MP?
It had never entered my mind to quote a jazz standard. But what happened is that I got somebody who said, I want to see you. And the Minister Stella Strau has asked me to speak to you. So I went to see him on a Sunday, I remember. And he said, Minister Strau says, I should tell you to consider joining the management of Transnet, because she is in the process of overhauling it and putting people into that. Subsequently, I went to have a discussion with Minister Strau, and I also went to have a discussion with President Mandela and also Deputy President Mbeki at that time, saying, should I go this direction or should I stay in Parliament? And both said to me, we seem to have the politics stabilized enough. What we are lacking is people who think like us in the broader economy. And to the extent that this will work, we suggest that you should take it. So I'd never intended to do it, and I never thought. And I said, well, I don't have experience in transport in any manner. I've got a bit of economics education, but on the other hand, I don't have to fly an aeroplane or pilot a boat or anything. What I do know is where this country is going and ought to go, and therefore what are the things that we need to do to make sure that this important muscle of the South African economy behaves inappropriately to the change that is happening.
What was it like coming into an organization like that as the boss? And I imagine it was an organization that, where were we, 1995, 1996, isn't very transformed.
No, it's not. And I'm fortunate that I came in as a deputy manager and director. There was Dr. Anton Mullman, who was the managing director. And I spent a couple of months, maybe 6 months, without any real work. I mean, like all deputies, I guess at certain points. And I used the time to try and understand the organization. So I took everybody who was reporting to me and said, please tell me what you do. Not what your title says or anything. I've got that on the program. Just tell me when you wake up and go to work, what do you do? And of course, they would explain, and some of them would be pretty condescending and say, well, you won't understand, however. But what I was trying to understand was, where were the levers that actually could lead us to the change that we wanted? When I became managing director, one of the first things I did was to get a consulting company to come and help me understand all the moving parts so that when we start doing things and making changes, we would be clear as to what we're trying to achieve and whether that's the correct lever for that particular change.
Saki, I mentioned that I would ask you about black economic empowerment, and it seems to me that black economic empowerment, and to an extent the concept of race-based redress, is under more pressure in South Africa now than it's been for probably 20 years. And I would suggest there are two reasons for that. The one is Trump. The second is that the DA is now in the coalition government. And so it's kind of caught in this pincer movement. And there are people, I mean, when I speak on a stage and someone will ask a question, will BE survive? You can see an expectation in the audience sometimes. Will you defend BE? Do you believe it's still the right policy for us to follow?
Absolutely. I think people should just understand a very simple thing. You cannot have a political settlement without an economic consequence. And we were forced to compromise on radical economic transformation, to use that terminology, at the time of negotiations. And what we needed most then was stability, to stabilize the country and then deal with certain issues in the fullness of time, if you like. And therefore, one of the things we did in the negotiations on the Constitution was to make sure that the Constitution allows black economic empowerment. It wasn't even called that then, but allows redress. Precisely because we understood that there's no such a thing that you can have a group of people of a certain hue holding political power and another group of people with a different hue holding economic power. That's a recipe for disaster. And a lot of poor people in the process, and so until we have reached a certain particular equilibrium in between those two forces in society, we will always have tumultuous times. Would I defend it? Yes, absolutely. I believe that empowering people who have been previously disadvantaged is the right kind of thing. It may be that the terminology of black economic empowerment is the one that creates the emotion, if you like, especially if you think about foreigners. The fact of the matter is that we need to have the redress, and we have not done it to the extent that we should have. And I am also aware of the fact that I would not have done the kinds of things that I've done in my life if I had not had the opportunity granted to me by the policy of redress.
That was Saki Macozoma, the chair of Vodacom and Safika Holdings. Really, really interesting life story. So much to talk about how it affects us now.
Travel is more than just ticking off countries. It's about the people, the culture, the food, the moments. I'm Pippa Hudson, and on Wonder the World, I invite you to join me every week as we explore destinations both near and far, with the help of fellow adventurers who share their unique travel stories. Listen to my podcast wherever you get them.
702.
You're listening to the best of The Money Show.
The Money Show.
This week, personal finance, Warren Ingram, financial advisor, co-founder of Galileo Capital, he looked at the issue of buying a home. It is in some places an endless debate. Should you buy or should you rent? He's got some fascinating thoughts on all of this. You might want to get the spreadsheet out for this one and make sure that anyone you know is about to buy a home does get a copy of this conversation. Here's Warren.
It's such a tricky topic because there is a huge amount of emotion involved in this, and not that we should discount the emotion. I think there is tremendous value in recognizing that a lot of us find stability in owning a home, and that stability has a real value. And so, sometimes you don't make the very best spreadsheet financial decision, but you make the best decision for yourself and your families. How's that for sitting on the edge?
Well, yes. I mean, the other thing is, and I don't know if it's the case in other countries, I think it may be, but the generations that came before us were very much buy property. And you can understand why, because in their time, the price of property really only went up.
We have a massive fixation on property as South Africans. And what's interesting is we seem to export that fascination when we go overseas. So you see a lot of South Africans all around the world, and it's very normal for them to be on the property ladder as fast as they possibly can once they get to wherever they decide to move to. And very often they'll be strange in that country. They'll be unusual from the perspective that people in those countries, especially in the north, will never own a home. They'll rent for decades at a time, and they'll find it strange that people come from South Africa and buy. And I think that our parents and grandparents would have said, you're crazy to pay off a landlord's mortgage. Why are you doing that? You should always own the place you stay in, and doing anything else is silly. And I think that's a view that certainly 1, 2, and 3 generations ago they would have felt that very strongly. And anybody saying something different would have had a hard time, and probably would have been up there with believing in UFOs if you said I'm happy to rent for the rest of my life.
Okay, let's get into it a little bit. Some of the reasons not to, and some of them are to do with the cost of ownership, which I can confirm for you is higher than you might think.
I'm sorry to laugh. It's understanding that when you buy a home, most of us, if we buy a house, we might not buy a freestanding house in a suburb. We might end up buying an apartment in a body corporate, and especially for new buyers, first time buyers in a home in a body corporate, you might be thinking, well, that's fine. I don't have to worry about maintenance at all. I'm going to buy the house or the apartment, sorry, and I'm going to pay a monthly levy to the body corporate and my electricity and my water, and then everything's fine. That's not true. What we need to understand is that whether you own a freestanding house or you own an apartment, there is always maintenance. Whether it's the inside of the place, which needs to be repainted and maintained on a regular basis, or when you need to look at something like a special levy, because if you're in an apartment building, unfortunately that needs to get repainted as well, and that money doesn't come from the sky, that comes from you as the owner. And a lot of body corporates don't budget for this. So what happens is every 5 or 8 or 10 years, you suddenly get notification after an AGM that you are now paying a lot more money every month for your levies because you have a special levy. And so those kinds of costs tend to accumulate. And it's crazy when people move into a house. Let's just talk about a freestanding house. Even if it's a great house and you were clever in the way that you bought, it's just funny how things tend to fall apart. You could be in for 6 months and the geyser bursts. So the ownership costs are much more than you would think. And in contrast with a tenant, for example, when you go and rent a place, all of that is the landlord's issue. All you've got to do is pay your rent, make sure that you pay the electricity and the water, and everything else that goes wrong is an email, a WhatsApp, or a phone call away, and you then get an unhappy landlord who has to deal with that.
I mean, the other thing, and we really mustn't forget this, is that the cost of transacting in property, and it's easy to forget this, is actually very high. Buying and selling is, there are lots of costs that come along with it that are sort of government costs. You can't avoid them.
You're paying, just to kind of list them, without giving amounts for everything, but you're going to pay a form of tax called a transfer duty, and unless you're buying a low value property which falls below a threshold, you're going to pay the bank if you've got a bond. Almost all of us are going to have a bond, so you pay them for registering the bond on your property. You pay the lawyers for conveyancing fees. You pay bank costs over and above the bond registration. Then you pay administration fees. So for a home, and I just did a quick calculation, for a 5 million rand house, those costs all in could be somewhere around 420 to 480,000 rand, and that's not going to improve the value of the house. In other words, it's not like you've just painted the place or put in new built-in cupboards or something. That's gone. That money is just a sunk cost, and it doesn't add a cent to the mortgage that you now have and all the other things that you're going to do. So transaction costs are very high, and important to remember that if you want to sell the property one day, you're most likely going to pay an agent to sell the property for you. And nowadays, that cost is somewhere around 2.5% to 5% of the value of the property. And if it's an expensive property and you've done well out of the capital growth of the place, you most likely might pay additional capital gains taxes as well. So going into a property and selling the property one day, it's really expensive.
How important is time in the house then? If you're going to have this conversation, you're going to decide what you're going to do, how important is the amount of time you're going to spend in the house?
Well, I think let's take that. Just say 480,000 rand as a transaction charge. The longer the number of years that you stay in the property, the better. Because if you stayed in the house for 3 years and then you sold it, you're only getting 3 years worth of benefit for your 480,000 rands worth of costs that you've paid just to go in. And then you're going to pay a whole lot of money on the way out again to the estate agent. So what you want to do is limit the amount of transaction costs that you're going to pay. And the best way to do that is stay in the property for a very long period of time. And so spreading out those initial costs and the exit costs, over a decade or two would be a much better idea, because then your costs are just much lower. But the second thing is, now we get into the difference between renting versus owning. When you rent a place, the landlord is going to give you an escalation on that rent every year. In other words, they're going to say to you, you're paying 10,000 rand a month now. In a year's time with inflation, you might be paying whatever it is, 10,000 plus another 1,000 or another 2,000. And that will happen year after year after year. Your rent will never flatline unless you're in an area which is going down, and most likely then you'll want to move. If you contrast that with someone who's buying a house, and if they've got a mortgage or a home loan, what happens there is they have a rate of interest, and as long as the interest rate stays the same, their monthly repayments into that home loan will remain the same. And on the calculations I've done, and I've done this lots of times, but I know it's boring, but I do it for fun sometimes. It seems to me that on all of these calculations, if you stay in the house for a period of 8 years or longer, then it starts to work in your favor to be an owner and not a tenant. But if you're going to rotate properties more frequently, then, and let's say every 3 to 5 years, I can't really come up with a good case for being an owner. It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, so then under these circumstances, when is renting the sort of right choice? When does it make sense to be that person who's renting and sort of contributing to the owner's mortgage?
So let's think about a few life stages. So the first is we start our working career, and if you are like me, your working career means that all you can afford is not even a 1-bedroom place. You can afford something which is a bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and all in one place. And so you stay there for a period of time, and then hopefully if the career goes well, you get a bit of an increase, you can afford a bit more rent, and so you move into a bigger place. And if you're going to do that in, let's say, 3-year stages, and that seems to be the norm, then it makes no sense to buy any of the first few properties because you're going to be moving so frequently. And so there, at that stage of life, being a tenant makes a lot of sense. The second stage of life is maybe later on when you've got the family home, potentially you've had children, they've left the house, and you're starting to consider what to do next. I think a lot of the time there, you want to, potentially change at least suburbs, if not cities. And if that's the case, then don't buy the place on the other side straight away when you sell the family home. Then you need to be a tenant again, because you need to figure out where you want to be, what's the ideal size of place that you want to live in. And certainly later in life, I find older people want smaller houses. They don't want the maintenance hassles that Stephen's going through right now. What they want is a small garden or potentially no garden, and not much day-to-day work on the property. In which case, being a tenant for a period of time until you figured all that out, I think makes a lot of sense. And then maybe because this is the kind of modern world of work, a lot of people don't have a lot of stability in the way that they earn a salary. Not a lot of people are just getting a fairly comfortable, predictable salary. They're in the gig economy. And if you're in the gig economy where your salary and your package might be entirely variable, then owning a home becomes highly risky unless you really have a lot of money. Because what happens if you go through a 3 or 6 month period where your pickings are slim and you can't afford the mortgage? You can't go to the bank and say, look, it's tough times at the moment, just give me a bit of a break, I'll come back to you when I'm ready. The bank's going to say you owe us money, and if eventually, if we don't get paid, we're going to be forced to go to court and sell your property. And so that kind of stress when you're in an insecure kind of earning environment, I think is far too risky for people to commit to a property. So to me, those are kind of key points here. But time is the big one. I think that's the huge determining factor. The shorter the time, the shorter, the more weight in favor of renting.
That was Warren Ingram discussing whether buying a property is always the best option.
702.
You are listening to The Money Show's best bits.
How I Make Money this week, we spoke to Tuanni Price, the CEO of Zuri Wine Tasting, someone who's created a business both in LA and in Cape Town, all about wine. And she's not about making it necessarily. She's firmly in the drinking it camp. And she does so in a really entertaining way. Tuanni Price.
I was at a restaurant, a 5-star restaurant. It was my first time dining at a 5-star restaurant since my dad took me to dinner after I graduated from college. And the sommelier there was very snobby. And it just encouraged me to learn as much as I could about wine.
I mean, I must say, I'm a bit like you were then. I don't know much about wine. I can talk about whiskey all night, but my wife is the wine expert in my family. Was it difficult to learn? I mean, is wine kind of hard to talk? Is it hard to talk wine?
I think it's difficult when you first think about entering wine. But once you start learning about wine is related to culture, it's related to food, to history, and it's so fun. I actually started to learn about wine through food. So I would have a wine club with my friends, and one person was responsible for the wine and for the food. And I mean, that's the best way to learn about anything, right?
What was it about it that made you so determined? I mean, okay, sure, you have a bad experience. I can understand that. And you kind of want to show them. I've been like that too sometimes in my life. But was there something about wine that really grabbed you?
Well, it was before the dinner, right? So I worked for a 5-star hotel, and when I worked in accounting, I used to work in finance. And so I would have to walk from one hotel to the next hotel property. And I would walk through the lobby, and there were all these beautiful people with wine on the table. And they either looked like they were having a business lunch or they were having this girlfriend lunch, and they were just having this amazing time. And I said, you know what? I want that lifestyle. So for me, wine is not just about the beverage that's in your glass. It's about the entire lifestyle. And that's what I craved. And so my manager said, you're doing such a great job. Go have dinner in the restaurant. It's our treat. Take whoever you want. And when I went to the restaurant, that's when the embarrassing incident happened. And then that just sparked me to learn even more about wine. And the more I learned, the more I fell in love with the culture and the lifestyle. And then I started a business.
If someone decides I'm going to learn about wine, and a lot of people will say, well, I'm going to learn about it by drinking it, but there's a lot of other stuff that you need to know. You need to know how to spell what's that word? Terroir, the soil out of which the grapes come.
Terroir, right?
Terroir. There we go.
Yes.
Go on.
And you have to know, like, why. I mean, the part of the fun for me is learning why wine tastes a certain way that it tastes, right? So orange juice, no matter, it usually tastes about the same, right? Orange juice tastes like orange. But wine, Cabernet tastes totally different than Syrah. A Sauvignon Blanc tastes totally different than a Riesling. And they're all made from grapes. So why do they taste differently? Like, what happens in the vineyard? What happens in the cellar? Why do they taste differently? So wine is not, it's not simple. I always say that my motto for my business when I first started, and it's still my motto pretty much, is wine is complicated. I make tasting simple, right? So it's really complicated how you get to these different layers of flavors.
I mean, that's the joy of it, or so people tell me, is that, you know, sometimes bottles can even be slightly different. There sort of should be some standardization, but it is so varied, you don't really know what you're going to get, and there are very different flavors to sort of look for. There's an experience to wine, the smell of it, how it sort of moves in the glass, all of those things.
Yes. And like, you're right. Different vintages can taste different. So a wine that you drank in 2020 can taste totally different than the wine that you had in 2022. And then it starts a conversation piece. And that's why I really like wine too, because it sparks conversation, right? Because now you're talking about why the 2020 vintage tastes different than the 2022 vintage. If you remember 2020, it was very, very cold that year, right? So the wines are a little bit tighter. They're not as fruit forward as the 2022, which was a warmer winter, a warmer year. So it just sparks conversation. And obviously I love talking. So yes.
What's the best way to learn about wine? I mean, you could probably go online and come back with a vast amount of information about wine. I'm sure there are winemakers' blogs and grape farmers' blogs and all sorts of things that you could just learn from that. Is it better to be a bit more structured about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that structure is the best way to learn about wine, right? Just to read about it, to study like you would study anything else, right? But the best way to really experience wine and learn it in a practical way is to taste with friends, to just taste whenever you can, taste bad wine, so-called bad wine, taste so-called amazing wines, and see, okay, like, you know what? I had that wine. I thought that wine was a bad wine. And I had this wine. I thought it was amazing. But what's the difference? What is it? You know, maybe the wine that you thought was amazing had really nice acidity. Maybe you can actually identify some of the flavors and some of the aromas in the wine. There's just different things. And for some people really like sweet wine. I don't like sweet wine. So not unless it's like, gosh, the Melanu El Rosa, I probably wouldn't say, oh my God, this is such an amazing sweet wine, right? And the reason that wine is so sweet is because it's so complex, right? It has so many different layers and flavors. And for me, that makes a good wine. But if you don't like all that, you just might like a simple, like, what is that wine? Gosh, I'm not going to even say the name, but you just might like a nice old J. LaRue wine, right? That you use for a celebration, and it's sweet and it's easy to drink. So, yeah.
So how did you start? I mean, did you start on the internet? Did you watch wine videos? Did you go to events? Did you take a formal class in winemaking or something?
I definitely took formal classes. So I started with the wine club with my girlfriends, learning about wine. And then I started studying with the Society of Wine Educators. I was in the West Coast in the United States. And then I studied with the North American Sommelier Association. And I was just always taking wine classes. And then I started to travel for wine, right? Because it was so fun learning about these different wine regions. And then I would go to them. I'd learn about Barolo. Then I'd go to Piemonte and I'd taste Barolos. I'd taste Prosecco. In the city where it was actually made. And that's how I actually ended up in Cape Town. So I was doing this whole thing of traveling. I love Spain. I love Spanish wines. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to move to Spain. And then I was like, wow, before I move to Europe, I need to visit the motherland. I have to come to Africa. And I picked South Africa because of its history with apartheid. And I picked Cape Town because it was so close to the winelands. And I came here and I stayed for 3 weeks. And I absolutely just love the wine culture and the wines in Cape Town, in Stellenbosch, in French. Yeah.
So you were then trying to make a business out of it. Now, that's a different thing. It's one thing to learn about business, to learn about wine, but to actually make a business out of it. How did you go about doing that?
I was working in corporate America and I was doing very well for myself, but I wanted like a side business. And I said, okay, I want this side business in wine. And I thought, how can I make money with wine? And I came up with this business idea, in-home wine tastings. You know, like people have like Mary Kay parties, things, Tupperware parties. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to go to people's houses because I love talking about wine and sharing all the knowledge. I was doing this in my house. I would invite my friends over for wine and for food, and I teach them anything new that I learned about wine. So I started this private in-home wine tasting business, and it was so much fun. So I would get wines from this store, very fancy store in Los Angeles, and snacks, nice wine bites. And then I'd come to people's houses and I'd show them about this wine and how it paired with these snacks, how to pair wine and food and what to look for in the qualities of wine. I remember I just had a standard menu. I had a Sauvignon Blanc because it's easy to teach about Sauvignon Blanc because the flavor profile is usually the same. You could taste a Sauvignon Blanc and know it's a Sauvignon Blanc. The acidity, the herbaceousness. And then I would do a Riesling because it was a little bit sweet, and I would pair that with like something spicy. And then I do a Pinot Noir because Pinot Noir is the lightest of all the red wines for the most part. And it was easy to talk about that. I just wanted to make it really simple so people can just get the basics of wine. And then I do like a Syrah Cabernet Sauvignon. And it became really popular. Like I was featured on this website called Groupon, and I sold like 250 units. So like the first year of my business, I spent the entire summer hosting private in-home wine tastings. I do one on Friday. I do like 3 on Saturday. I do like 2 on Sunday.
Sure.
And yeah, I didn't really have a lot of resources. And I just, prepaid for the wine class, bought the supplies with that. And that was a very simple business model when I first started.
Could you have done this, without social media? 30 years ago, you would have had to, and we spoke to someone else in the start, when she started her business, it was a sort of personal gym business at home. It was pamphlets under windscreens, leaflets under windscreens. You started yours in the era of social media. Did that make it easier?
I think social media made it a lot easier. But, I think the best thing and the best advice that I would give anybody who wants to start a business is like, search your network, right? Like my first customer was a coworker's cousin who hired me, right? And I did such a great job, so use your network, do a great job so you get referrals. And so then I got referrals. And basically my business when I first started was, it was social media because I used Groupon. It was just like a social website. And then it was referrals, word of mouth.
That was Tuanni Price, CEO of Zuri Wine Tasting, sharing her story and talking about how she's made her money.
The best of the Money Show
on 702.
702.
Your business book review this week, Bronwyn Williams, partner at Flux Trends, looked at the book The End of Money by David Buckham, Robyn Wilkinson and Chris Straeuli, looking at the end of trust, the erosion of trust in capitalist markets and democratic and Western democratic institutions, and then looking at what's happening in the Chinese banking system. There's a stark contrast.
Yeah, it's definitely a book about trust or lack thereof and what we get when trust breaks down. But it's far more than just a critique on the Western side of the market. They also have equal and opposite concerns about what's happened with, say, the more Asian sides of the market coming out of the more kind of Beijing consensus. But in essence, this book is kind of an accelerated history lesson with a little bit of futurism thrown in, a sort of fast-track recap of the last 100-ish years when it comes to money, that is the people who look after it, our banks, and of course those who regulate it or fail to do so, that is our governments. And what happens when the trust in the systems that underpin our entire global economy, but also critically, as they point out, really that underpin our social contracts. Both the more communist and the more capitalist social contracts are underpinned, of course, with this idea that you need to contribute, do your bit. In exchange, you're going to be looked after by your society. This is how you get people to do things. And when people feel that doing things, that participating in the system doesn't get them what they want out of the system, we get a breakdown in trust first. And as we've seen with the more recent updates of the Alderman Trust Index, which of course looks at trust across the world, that a further deceleration or watering down of trust in society leads to grievance. This idea that by contributing, someone else is winning and I am losing, which is a very dangerous place to be. And in essence, the book is a warning against what happens when trust breaks down. Well, when trust breaks down, we revert to a state of nature, to anarchy. And one of the perhaps more controversial ideas that the authors come up with is that cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin in particular, but the idea of crypto in general, is in essence a symptom of anarchy. So it's a trustless system, which of course both proponents and critics of things like cryptocurrencies will admit to. But this idea that a trustless society is really an anarchy, a place where no one is safe, and that we kind of need strong financial institutions and strong regulation in order to keep ideas like democracy and of course even the more sort of authoritarian systems stable and going, if not at least growing. So it really is all about trust, as you said, and what happens when, well, we don't have much of it.
So, I mean, this is it gets to the heart of it, which is that I find it difficult to understand why people would trust a system created by someone who we don't even know their real name, rather than Lesetja Kganyago, where I kind of know where his day job office is, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so if you're talking about, of course, cryptocurrencies, there's all this mystery around it. And it is a system that is based purely, essentially, on belief in the system, of course, but also belief in maths. And this is where it gets quite interesting. The author's criticism of cryptocurrency is that, in essence, the ideas of cryptocurrency, this idea of a trustless system based on maths, is not all that unlike, at least in the view of the authors, the blind faith we're supposed to have in our more formal fiat currency monetary systems, where we're supposed to believe the maths of like the Black-Scholes model that'll tell you the exact risk of a derivatives market trade, lol, or of course the maths that'll show you that modern monetary theory, or QE, can totally be a sustainable long-term solution for a degrowing world, for example. Or in the case of China and actually in the West too, as they point out, the idea that debt can kind of be kicked, that can of debt can be kicked in almost multiple times down the road without consequence. These are all very big stories that people are being asked to believe in the face of slowing and degrowing real life day-to-day experiences with the economy and what they put into it and what we get out of it.
I mean, there's so much to it because while this has been happening in the West, payment systems, the way that people understand money seems to have changed rapidly in China.
Yeah, so this is, of course, the compare and contrast. They kind of alternate in the book between a bit of Western monetary policy history and Chinese monetary policy history. And they see some of the things that are very, very similar. The ideas that, of course, that growth at all costs is a good thing. But also they look at how, in essence, what's happening now as we sort of fast forward to the second decade in the 21st century, that it looks like there's this kind of trade-off between growth and control. And the West has largely, by and large, chosen growth over control. And that has led, of course, to anarchy and the absolute explosion in private currencies and cryptocurrencies and all sorts of weird and wonderful financial instruments that, of course, allow banks to play with each other's money and our money, with the sort of underpinning of perhaps being bailed out by future taxpayers. That's become kind of the norm of the system there, which is corrupt in its own way. And China played that game for a while when it was growing fast. But the book's authors argue that China is increasingly now, as they were writing this coming out of COVID in about 2021, 2022, I think it was published, they were saying China looks like it's deciding to go in the other direction and choose control over growth as a different sort of path forward. Now, whether those predictions play out or not, it is an interesting kind of dichotomy they pick up on there. What do we really want? What do governments really want? And what do people really want? Do people want the flip side of control, which is, of course, security? Do you want control and security, or do you want growth and risk? And quite frankly, the answers to those questions haven't been answered well by any current global power, which is why the authors say you've got space for these absolute anarchist ideas to come into the picture, to solve that equation in a way that feels more palatable to a general global population that is not pleased with the status quo, whether you are in Los Angeles today, or whether you are in the lying down flat movements in China, or whether you are South African who is unemployed. The economy isn't working out for most people. And this is, of course, where space for chaos can creep in. And I found it very, very interesting reading the book, given that a lot of my research over the last couple of years has been at exactly that, how many of the people faced with an unfair system can turn either to anarchy or to apathy, right? Or to a sort of lesser extent towards some form of activism. And it's interesting to kind of see those same sort of strains playing out in people's responses to an increasingly unfair, or at least seemingly unfair economy.
I was intrigued by the fact that the authors are sitting here in South Africa talking about kind of the rest of the world. And I mean, there's a lot to say about our economy, but the rest of the world does affect us. So I was just intrigued by that. Do you think they bring something to it that maybe other people have sort of missed? Is there a South African understanding, perhaps, of, an attempt to sort of be, what's the phrase I'm looking for, aggressively non-aligned, that maybe helps us understand it in a way that other people don't?
Well, personally, I do agree with that philosophy. I've spoken quite a lot about this in my work in looking at economic futures and looking at foresight and future studies too. South Africa is quite uniquely positioned in between, very literally, East and West, old world, new world, the petro economy and the tech economy. We've got loads of startups in Cape Town. We're a little bit of a patchy economy. And we've got mixed, as you say, alliances in terms of which sort of faction wins out in the future. Well, we've got irons on a lot of those fires, right? So we can have a little bit more of an objective perspective, but we also are at the forefront of really experiencing a lot of the theoretical ideas, which again is one of the big ideas criticized in this book, this idea that maths in theory doesn't always translate into economic prosperity in practice for people. We've certainly tested out a few of those ideas for ourselves, for better or for worse, and that gives us a bit of perspective to write. It is important to note that this particular book doesn't come, although it's written by people who have history in South Africa, it's certainly not a South African book. It is a global book. It's trying to look at the global perspective. And that's quite interesting. Usually these books are either written about the American monetary system, assuming the American monetary system is the only monetary system, or looking only at either critiquing or condoning, or of course advising like the East as being our global future. They've tried to give a bit of a balance between the two. They're not exactly sold by either worldview at the moment. What I didn't see them make too much of a connection with is just how tied the two worlds are in our global economy. I would probably have liked to see a little bit more about that. But South Africa itself barely gets a mention unless they sort of comparing global statistics, of which South Africa might pop into the pack. If, say, they're looking at unemployment figures or national debt to GDP ratios, just to kind of see the spectrum of where countries sit in the world. So it's certainly not a South African book, but I do think South Africans do have a bit of a unique and interesting perspective to bring to global conversations. And it's something that we see in terms of our actual geopolitical, influence in world affairs. We're quite small, but we have more influence than perhaps the size of our economy demands, just due to our very unique position between all the various different global players across the global economy.
That was Bronwyn Williams, partner at Flux Trends, sharing her perspective on the end of money. You've been listening to the best bits of The Money Show, just a digest of some of the most important insights, thoughts and interviews from the show this week. If you'd like to hear more, please go to our website or your favorite podcast app and search for The Money Show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with The Money Show from 6 o'clock on Monday. Have a good weekend.